This video is an introduction to the executive in the United Kingdom. What does an executive do? Well, it's responsible for the day-to-day running of government, makes policy and introduces legislation to the legislature. In the United Kingdom, we mustn't just think of the executive as the Prime Minister, but also of Cabinet and other associated bodies too. Now, executive power historically used to reside with the monarch, but since the early 18th century, the monarch has taken less of a political role, and we see today that many of the so-called prerogative powers that once were in the hands of the monarch are now exercised by the Prime Minister or Cabinet. It's important to note here before we move on that in most countries, like the United States, the executive is separate from the legislature. But remember that in the United Kingdom, our executive comes from it, not just the Prime Minister, but the majority of Cabinet too. The vast majority of Cabinet will be sitting MPs, some will be members of the House of Lords. Like many elements of the British Constitution, the role of the Prime Minister emerged organically, unlike the roles that are set out for the US President in the form of their constitution. Now, the first recognised Prime Minister is Sir Robert Walpole. Although that title wasn't given to him at the time, he was officially Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer and Leader of the House of Commons. And he performed that role from 1721 to 1742. And as I said, although he wasn't referred to as Prime Minister at the time, if we assign that title to him, he remains the longest serving Prime Minister in British history. And initially, the Prime Minister was viewed as primus inter pares, the first among equals. The idea that every individual member of the executive was equally responsible and powerful, but among them, the face of the executive, the person holding it all together, was the Prime Minister. Now, today, many people will argue that the Prime Minister has become more than that, more powerful than that, and indeed is presidential in their powers. And we will look at that in future videos. Now, the role of the Prime Minister wasn't clearly set out. One thing that we do get from 1992 onwards is a ministerial code, and that was set up to set out the duties and the expectations of the Prime Minister and government ministers. So there is, in effect, a code of conduct and a brief outline of what's expected of government ministers in the ministerial code. So, how do you become the Prime Minister? Well, you need to be the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons. Now, formally, it's the role of the monarch to invite that individual to take on the role of Prime Minister. But convention of the British Constitution dictates that they must do this. Now, it's slightly easier in some circumstances than others. For David Cameron and Theresa May in 2010 and 2017, after those elections, both of those leaders, they led the largest party in the House of Commons, but the party didn't have a majority in the Commons. And so in 2010, David Cameron's Conservatives agreed a coalition agreement with the Liberal Democrats. In 2017, Theresa May's Conservative Party arranged a supply and confidence agreement with the DUP, and that enabled them to have a working majority in the Commons and led to them being invited to form a government. And so when you don't have a majority in the Commons, you do still get the first refusal, the first attempt to form a government. Now, you would think that winning an election is the easiest way to become Prime Minister, but the last Prime Minister to do that was David Cameron in 2010. Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, the last four Prime Ministers, all became Prime Minister by becoming leader of their party. So Theresa May won an uncontested race in the end, replacing David Cameron in 2016. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in 2019 after the resignation of Theresa May. And he beat Jeremy Hunt. Liz Truss also won the Conservative Party election in 2022. She served for only 45 days before Rishi Sunak took the job. Sunak won the post in October 2022, and like Theresa May in 2016, he stood uncontested. So you don't have to win an election to become Prime Minister. Now, if you look at certainly the post-war period, quite often that is the case. But since 2010, it hasn't been. So the last Prime Minister to lose his job, or their job, in an election was Gordon Brown in 2010. David Cameron became Prime Minister after that election, but he did need a coalition agreement with the Liberal Democrats in order to make that happen. It is worth noticing, though, that even though the last 4 Prime Ministers didn't win an election to become the Prime Minister, both Boris Johnson and Theresa May won elections as sitting Prime Ministers, where they both decided after winning the job that they needed to get the consent of the British people, and so stood for election and respectively won those elections as sitting Prime Ministers.